Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, let's get started. This is the first meeting in the spring schedule of the Program on Constitutional Government, and a stellar one it is with John Walters. This impressive-looking man, is the former drug czar in the George W. Bush administration. He's not afraid of us because he's faced many congressional hearings. He's well versed in hostile questions, so don't try to blow him over. He's now executive vice president of the Hudson Institute in our nation's capital, and he's previously served in the Department of Education and the National Endowment for the Humanities with William Bennett. He's a graduate of Michigan State and has an MA from the University of Toronto. That's really enough for academic credentials, I'd say. Yeah. So he's not a man who wasted his life being a graduate student. So this is John P. Walters, and he's going to talk about addiction and American democracy.
Thank you, Harvey.
Yeah.
I'm going to stand up for a little bit of this, then I'll sit down for the discussion part. Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's great to see many friends that I don't get to see often enough, so thank you for coming. And I'll try not to waste your time, but I've already had more than just reward from seeing many of you, so thank you. That introduction, in the words of kind of substance abuse talk, I think of myself sometimes as a recovering academic. So, but I was blessed to work for Bill Bennett, who was also originally educated to go into the academy, and so many of the times our approach to issues of public policy or thinking issues through was quite a bit like a seminar, and I'm not sure all government officials behave like that, but I think it's helpful, and we tried to find some of the smartest people we could find, or we knew, or our people we knew, and bring them in and talk to them, and he was nice enough to have a lot of us young guys who learned a lot and tried to contribute. Probably the net result was we got more than we gave, but it was an interesting way to think about government, and it was profoundly less cynical than you think about government, and that's been my experience in public service. That yes, there's a lot of things that come together in politics, but that the overwhelming majority of the people I worked with were trying to do the right thing and figure out what that was, and try to make other people's lives better, which I think is not the typical view, especially with current television dramas, presentations of politics in America, not only to ourselves, but to our friends in the world. If you wanted to construct a public diplomacy that was more destructive to American ideals, it would be hard to construct one. But that's what freedom's about, is letting you do what you want sometimes. I'm going to talk a little bit about that with regard to drugs. And I thought, because this topic covers a lot of different things, I'm not going to try to be, and I couldn't be any way comprehensive or just. I'll leave the time that we have together after I sit down to let you ask questions you're interested in, and either things I say or don't say that are pertinent or other related issues. I wanted to focus on, both because of the nature of this program and my conversation with Harvey, is about why I think this is a difficult issue for American democracy and free people in general. There's a lot of specific things, and this is, like many political things, one that is, of course, over-explained. I presume almost everybody in the room has a theory or a view of what this problem, issue, principles affecting it are. I find that the little I do now of talking to college students, for example, as I said to Harvey when he invited me, they are, of course, experts on the drug problem. I am simply an amateur from the outside. And so a lot of that personal experience is pertinent, and some of that personal experience is sometimes idiosyncratic. I guess I'll divide my brief remarks into two parts, and I'll try to keep it brief. One, I'd like to kind of talk about the problem generally, and then because of what I'm going to do to characterize a problem as a policy issue or as a governance issue, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the data, not all the data, but because I think that is in keeping with the nature of the problem. I mean, first, what is this phenomenon? And I do think that personal experience can be helpful, depending on its character. In my experience, almost every American today, whether it's a good thing or a regrettable thing, has had experience with substance abuse. Not personally necessarily, although some have, and quite extensive experiences and painful experiences, but also in family and among friends and colleagues, whether that's in the form of drug addiction or alcohol dependency, alcoholism. It's something that we know. What is this? I mean, it's something that changes people. If the phenomenon didn't have those negative effects, of course, we wouldn't be talking about it. We didn't understand this, and we still have mixed understandings of what this phenomenon is today. I mean, we've tried to use the tools of science to see what happens to individuals, but there is, of course, as there is in science, a debate about what the soundness of some of those understandings are. I'll tell you that in making government policy, the people I work with, and I think that's still true today in the current administration and government institutions, would try to use the best medical science we can to understand this. That has changed. I mean, when I was young, I think and still in parts of, as I say, people in our culture today, they viewed substance abuse dependency as a moral failure. It was a matter of character more than anything else, that either you did these things, or if you did these things and you got into trouble, that you didn't manage yourself, control yourself. I think that's also somewhat tied to the nature of our free society. We expect people to have freedom. We expect them to make their own choices. We expect them to be able to face consequences if they make bad choices, either societal or personal, and we want that freedom. We want that individual freedom to in some ways, the greatest extent possible. I don't think today anybody, certainly that looks at this with current knowledge, thinks of substance abuse as a matter of character, simply. We understand it as something that affects the chemistry of the brain and changes the nature of individuals as a result of the changes it makes in the chemistry of the brain. Some of that work is done, of course, very profoundly here in Boston and at this institution. And I think that in the old days it was thought that, you know, kind of weak people or people who, you know, had bad character were subject to this. We now know that all of us can be made to be alcoholic or addicted. It's because the phenomenon has to do with the exposure to certain chemicals with sufficient frequency and extent that it causes, you know, craving, it causes impairment of judgment, it causes withdrawal symptoms when you're not using it. The so-called discussion of addiction as a disease, I think, is quite pervasive and largely not debated in the main realm in which debate takes place. So what that means is you have a phenomenon that not everybody who's exposed to it, and it would be better in some ways for the purposes of clear principles if it was a kind of, if you do this, this always happens. But it doesn't, of course, as in many human phenomena. You can take these substances and different people have different risks, some of which we understand, we think a bit, some of which we don't. There can be inherited risks. That's why we think that's associated with things like a family history of substance abuse, or of dependency or higher risk. But it's also true that, as I say, whether or not you have a family history, whether or not you have a family history, you can be subject to these things. Secondly, we know we can treat this. We know we can help people with these kinds of behavioral problems overcome them. There are, of course, millions of people in America who are today in so-called recovery, or they're not taking drugs and they're not drinking, who had serious problems with addiction and alcoholism and are living productive lives. In fact, one of them was the last president of the United States. I remember a meeting once with the Chinese official who was, not offending anyone, with the particular job he had and his particular nature. He was actually a thug. And he wanted to show me he was a tough guy by telling me that, the way they handle substance abuse is they identify addicts, they separate them from the population, round them up, and put them in a place where they all live together alone, and that's best for them and best for society, kind of challenging me to show that I was hard-headed. And I said, well, actually, he said, well, what do you do? And I said, well, actually, we try to help treat them and make them, again, into productive members of society, our brothers and sisters. And I did say to him, and one of them is the President of the United States. And we turned to other topics. So I think both the what we've learned and what we can do now is important in the way you think about policy today. It doesn't change the issue of how this is a problem for democracy. In fact, in some ways, it makes it more nuanced and complicated. But one of the things that this phenomenon is also talked about, and why I think details make a difference, is as if it were kind of intractable. That this is a kind of secular version of original sin, or Thanatos. It's just embedded in human nature, and it always has a certain rate and amount and doesn't go away. Well, in fact, this phenomenon has actually moved a lot. The first slide I brought you is a kind of comparison. Sorry, there's so much kind of busyness on there, but it's a comparison basically of cigarette use, marijuana and cocaine are the illicit drug example in the center, and then alcohol use. Now, the issue of measurement is a serious issue here because of the problem of looking at phenomenon on both a large scale and also phenomenon where it's not transparent. That is, people have to be asked, and sometimes they have reasons for saying yes or no. In some cases, we know something about production and, for example, rates of consumption over the population. We have relatively good data about how much was produced, and we know how big the population is from census data and the like. But what you see here is these phenomena have actually changed a lot over time. They've gotten bigger, they've gotten smaller, even though we have different data. And in fact, they move much more rapidly than a lot of other domestic policy phenomena. If you looked at things like SAT scores, or out-of-wedlock births, or dropout rates, those are much slower and much less susceptible to various influences, both in terms of policy and in terms of social attitudes. You'll see that despite the argument that, for example, we don't change the rate, that in fact, both the rate of marijuana use and cocaine use has dropped by roughly 2/3 between the measured peak in the late 70s, and this goes to 2005 in this particular study and array. Cigarette use, you see the slower, but a general decline, not quite the same, gross reduction in the phenomenon. And alcohol, you see also a significant decline. And for those who look at this in terms of, for example, prohibition, which we all have taught, almost it seems like from the time we watched Sesame Street, that of course prohibition didn't work. In fact, prohibition radically reduced the consumption of ethanol in the society, and it didn't regain the 1920 levels until you can see almost into the 1970s. And there's some theories about why that is, but it did happen, despite debates about whether it was a policy we wanted to continue. One of the other problems in looking at this phenomenon is the nature, as we see it, of the phenomenon of addiction itself. And I would say three characteristics of this phenomenon for a democratic people. One is what it does to change the individual, so that if you have a family member who's an alcoholic or dependent, when you go to Thanksgiving dinner, they are different when they're drinking. Oh, and they drug me. You know, mom's different, dad's different, your brother's different, your uncle's different. And part of that difference is what the substance and the pattern of use does to most people. There are variations, but it's general. And the phenomena that they're experiencing is both what I would call the push and the pull of the way these substances we believe work on your body. That you're first drawn to them because of the euphoric effect or source of pleasure, and then they are tied, we believe, to intense systems of pleasure that are originally designed for survival. And then, of course, your body also adjusts to these kind of chemical assaults. So it tries to go back to normal, which is what is generally believed to be the reason why you have withdrawal. Is that in fact when you're not using the drug, you feel sick, and your body then needs the drug to go back to normal because it has made adjustments. So part of the process of treatment is to try to manage those physiological issues, but also the problem then is you're kind of drawn to this. But secondly, the nature of this in itself, we know, impairs judgment, so that the individual suffering under this kind of chemical use also doesn't see the world in the same way. That's why it's possible to be able, that's why we believe the kind of self-destructive behavior you can see is possible. You can continue to do this to the detriment, obvious and manifest detriment of yourself and your well-being, so that the kind of hijacking of the pleasure and preservation systems ends up being so complete that it ultimately works to self-harm. And finally, and maybe most perniciously in some ways, we know that there's a kind of denial process in this. So when you have a relative or a friend who's having alcohol substance abuse problems, if you tell them, look, I think you've got a problem, it's a disease, maybe you ought to go see somebody. Many of us have done this. They don't say, oh, really? Well, thank you. Can you drive me to the doctor on next Monday? They get angry and and they yell and they resist. And that is a part of this phenomenon that also makes it difficult for especially people who love freedom and want to respect other people's individual rights and their own choices, is now you have somebody who is intentionally being self-destructive, but what's my right to intervene? What's the basis for which society, as well as we as individuals, family members and friends, can act in our own mind and in a way that's acceptable to the community and the society? My argument would be that this is a problem that manifestly falls into the area not so much of principle and right, although I think principles and rights are involved, but it's manifestly in the area of prudence, and something where you have to look at what's the magnitude, what can you do, are the things you can do consistent with the broader political principles and notions of justice of our society. I'm going to try to play with the technology, which I'll talk a little bit about the numbers. So the one question is, how big is the problem? If it's a small problem, it could be still sad, painful, and bad for individuals, but why would we have to have a national law? Why would we have to have programs, and how big how big does this become? This is an example of one of the surveys the government funds and has for a long time, one of the longest ones. This is of high school students, now 8th, 10th, and 12th graders. This was, I'm giving you a kind of snapshot of what you see, what I saw when I was in government about this phenomenon, and I'll speak about the broader phenomenon, but I'd also like to kind of just talk about the problem you face in trying to govern this that I am personally familiar with. This is what happened, and this is the rates of use. There's a category, it's called current use, which is have you used once in the past month or more frequently. This is what happened to these phenomena, and it includes alcohol and cigarettes. They generally all went down. And the general phenomenon with all these has been that, unlike what people say, like this is like whack-a-mole, one goes up, one goes down, or the balloon phenomenon, if you're familiar with that. In fact, the general trend has been all up and all down. although there are effects that you see that make a difference about the rate of it being down. I mean, some of this had to do, for example, with methamphetamine, with an effort some of you maybe remember about, yes?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, what about all this like prescription pain? It seems like everybody's switching from this kind of stuff to abusing that, and I haven't seen that in any of the statistics, so is it possible that those rose while all these declined for other reasons?
Pharmaceuticals. They did go up. And one of the things I was going to, that this is just as good a place to look at is, in addition to the kind of general kind of trends about behavior, also availability makes a difference. Because these substances have to be both available and they have to be ingested, you need both the desire or the area generally called prevention or acceptance, and you need the actual substance itself to be available. Now, we have a problem with prevention now, in terms of that. We have a lot of people who have used these substances. Also, the substances have been embedded in various ways, including cigarettes and alcohol, in our culture as a kind of normal and accepted phenomenon. And we're trying to change some of that. I mean, take the example of cigarettes. I mean, some of us here are old enough to remember where, if we had this meeting in this room, people would be smoking. And nobody would dare raising an issue about that. Now, it's a crime to smoke in this room. And we're using, law as well as persuasion and education to change the way, and we have changed the way people behave. Prescription pharmaceuticals, generally synthetic opioids, have been the largest area of growth. Have grown as more and more powerful ones were more widely available. They've been more. There's a different category. They have it go into I think the pathway in which that substance, that category of drugs has been a source of abuse. There's now also, an article in the Washington Post today about people shifting from synthetic painkillers to heroin, part of the heroin group. What is not as prominent as it should be in that is there's also been an explosion of heroin production in Mexico. Reasons for that as well, but so it's a combined phenomenon. But anyway, this shows you the magnitude of the problem I was pointing to, and the magnitude of not just use, but dependency, and the categories of dependency. We know that some of these substances have different rates at which use of them tends to become intense or habitual or addictive, and you see that in this slide. And again, this is a different survey, but this measures people in households, a sample of households in the United States, a representative sample estimated to cover roughly 95% of American households of people aged 12 and above. There are problems with self-reported surveys. It's not a census. This is not God's look at the world that you see in the movies where we know everything from perfect knowledge. It's self-reported. So the probable phenomenon are greater. That we don't catch everybody, especially on the dependent side, because they're not sitting in the house waiting for the nice man from the government to come and survey them. I testified in the Reagan administration before Charlie Rangel, and he said, excuse me, when somebody reported these stories, the nice man from the government comes to my constituents in Harlem and says, excuse me, it's going to be top secret, but do you use drugs? And he says, I don't believe these surveys. Yeah.
John, unless I'm missing something, these aren't trend data. The gentleman asked if there's an increase. This doesn't necessarily sustain that.
I didn't speak to the trend data, but he asked me about what's the magnitude of prescription drugs as well.
Okay.
I'm trying to get the magnitude. Some of the previous ones, I don't have a separate slide on the opioids. Let me see if I can go back. Does this go both ways?
But you seem to have granted there is a trend.
Yes,
Yeah.
there has been. And it was when I was in, technology is sometimes your friend, sometimes it's not. Can I make this go away? Well,
It's the way. Yeah.
yeah, but I want that other slide. There we go. Okay. Let's see. Can I make this go away? Well, yeah, but I want that other slide. 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 Yeah, but I want that other slide Does anyone know how to make this go back? There we go. Okay, here's a look at, just briefly, some of the other trend data. Now, this is a different source. This is from workplace drug testing, pre-employment and testing mostly. And this is not asking you whether you use. This is using a actual test with metabolites to determine what the rates of use were. It's not a cross-section of the population, however. There's the same for methamphetamine and cocaine. One of the problems in doing using this kind of testing data for synthetic opioids is the metabolite for many of these and heroin are going to look the same, so they don't distinguish it.
And what about the trend since 2007?
The trend since 2007 on the workplace data, I don't know off the top of my head. I suspect both the marijuana is up. The cocaine has been down more. That's largely a supply control success working with the Colombians now. As I said, heroin is up. Now this shows you treatment admission data. And this is a survey of people in treatment, but it also shows you the difference between not only individual substances that are causing people to come into treatment, and they generally look at a primary drug of abuse at the point of entry, but also 12 to 17-year-olds. So the year here is 2005 for this survey. These surveys aren't done every year because of the expense of doing some of this. But roughly 1.8 million people into treatment, and you see the various substances of abuse there. And again, the opioids will include both heroin and prescription pharmaceuticals that are synthetic opioids. And the difference for young people. Now, there's been debate about marijuana in particular. Of course, it's even been more recently. One of the things that has happened with marijuana is an increase in potency. The THC, the tetrahydrocannabinol, that's the psychoactive ingredient in marijuana, has changed over time. If you're a reader of High Times magazine, you will see that there's great joy in the hearts of the connoisseurs about the ability to drive the THC rate from what it was roughly in the 70s and 80s of up 2 to 3% to varieties that are not only 10 or 12% but go up to 20%. And now some of the entrepreneurs in Colorado have been on television talking about how they've created the crack of marijuana by various uses of hydrocarbons to both put into solution and then take out of solution the THC and create a kind of they claim 80-90% THC that can be used as a kind of, especially when vaporized, as you would a rock of crack, and put into your lungs, be an enormously powerful jolt to the brain. This is an example. I actually had this done with the survey data, where it takes those who are, there's a series of questions in some of these surveys to get at how many people are dependent. It asks you an adapted version of the questions that are used at intake for treatment about your behavior, about how if you say you've used, how that drug use is affecting your life or organizing your life around the use and continued use of these substances. Work, family relationships, your daily routine, and other things. And this takes, of those, this is 12 to 17-year-olds who say they have used these substances at least once in the past year. What percent then trigger enough of these factors to indicate they probably need some form of intervention because of the problematic character of their use, which would range anywhere from what's called abuse to dependency or full-blown addiction. There's a spectrum here. And for that, you see the difference. And the standard for cigarettes here is daily cigarette use, because there isn't the same category for nicotine. All right, I'll be quick on the rest of these. This is an effort to get at how big is the problem of denial and what do we do about it. Here you see, of those people who needed but did not receive treatment. And I believe this includes alcohol and illicit drugs. So you've got 21 million Americans in, let's say, 2006, who triggered the series of factors necessary to indicate they needed treatment. 4.5% felt they needed, and 1.5% felt they needed and made an effort to get it. This is not a if you build it, they will come problem. They will not come, and it's quite intense. Over 90% of the people who have the problem are not facing up or don't aware of it or blind to it or deny it. So one of the things that we did, following some of the recommendations of medical professionals, is create what was called a screening program, so that as a more customary part of medical treatment, you would ask people, as you do when you check for hypertension or you check for diabetes, this would be a question, not a blood test, of are you using these substances? There's a protocol that was developed to begin to ask people and then offer them. You have to both have the training to be able to use the tool, which is not that complicated, but also then have a way of referring them to various stages of help for their problematic use or abuse. And we began to implement it with pilot programs in a couple of different states. And then also we used it on college campuses, because I don't think I need to tell people who live on a college campus that both drugs and alcohol in particular have become relatively serious problems on college campuses. If anything, alcohol has even become more of a problem over the last 20, 30 years. In addition, what you find when you look at if you look at information, survey data done about how do people get into treatment, it turns out the single biggest reason that people get into treatment is the criminal justice system. Because of the nature of this push-pull and because of the denial involved, it is more or less true, a little bit casual, but more or less true, that almost everybody gets into treatment because they're forced. Now, that doesn't mean the law or somebody, dragging you in chains. But a family member, a spouse, an employer, the criminal justice system telling you you have to go, because there's a tendency to not go if you can possibly avoid it. The principal way the federal government does this is, for a number of years, going back to the 80s, we have used courts for people who are not violent, predatory individuals. We've tried to divert them into programs where when they break the law, when they're arrested, they're given an option after they're assessed to get court-supervised treatment, so that people who are going to continue to have a pattern of destructive behavior to themselves and others are then taken off that track if we can do that with treatment. And here you see the difference in parallel study of people who go into this and people who are helped by drug courts. The courts can mandate random testing. They can mandate what are called proportional sanctions. For example, that you get to go out, you get to look for a job, you get your freedom, but if you test positive, then you come back in and you're under order to be in your house over the weekend, or you're restricted in other ways until you begin to. These are state courts. There's a federal program that helped to fund and start up these. Many states like them because they save money on incarceration. Not that everybody who's referred to the drug court would go to jail, despite some of the views about jail. I'll talk about that just briefly in a minute. But of course, it also it stops the repetitive in and out of the justice system and the harm they do to themselves and others. Estimates that have been done on, for example, the child welfare system have been 80 to 90% of child abuse and endangerment cases involve parent or the adult that's in contact with the child having substance abuse problems. So drug courts have been used for custody and family court decisions, as well as you see now what are so-called problem-solving courts looking at mental illness, getting now people who are coming into the criminal justice system because of mental illness, who are not a violent threat to others, being diverted into court-supervised care. That's also, of course, a difficult issue for a democracy. Do you want the government mandating you to have to undergo certain kinds of care? There are governments in this world that use the medical system to tyrannize and to remove people's freedom. One of the things in working with the Russians when I was in, was, look, we want to build treatment facilities because Russia has a huge problem, especially with alcohol, but also with heroin and other drugs. And the problem they had is, of course, the psychiatric hospitals of the past that you would have used to put people into, and nobody wanted to go to. They certainly, you were really going to have to drag them in there because that was the place you went to be punished for thinking what the regime didn't want you to think. There's a long debate about, and this is the cost of what does a free society can do and what's the cost of it, the magnitude, about the use of the law in this problem and the use of the prisons as a punishment for the violation of the law that's connected to this problem. Unfortunately, a lot of that discussion has been largely distorted. There are three essential jail or prison systems in the United States. The smallest is the federal prison system. Relatively small portion of offenders actually now are there for drug-related crimes, although it's a significant portion because of the interdiction international programs the federal government does, as well as major organized crime attacks. But now the largest single area of federal activity is other federal crimes, and now, especially during the Obama administration, is enforcement of immigration laws, where people are incarcerated in the federal system. The largest prison system is the state prison system. There's a smaller one that's the so-called jail system, which is usually for people for short-term offenses that are held locally. But the state prison system is the largest. It is run between roughly 1.2 and probably 2.6 million, or excuse me, 1.2 and about 2 million or so, 1.6 million. But in fact, who is in jail and prisons, especially with regard to some of these charges about people being locked up for possession of amounts of marijuana, is simply not possible to argue if you actually look at the facts. Many, in most states, those who are incarcerated are violent repeat offenders, and real repeat offenders. I'm not talking about you did it twice, 3 times, multiple times. And those are just the times you got caught. Some of the possession charges that you see reported are people who were actually arrested for dealing, because 90% in many jurisdictions of these cases are pled out. They in fact pled to a lower charge, and therefore that's what shows up as the charge of their base of their punishment. Thirdly, many of the people who are violent repeat offenders, when they're arrested, especially in cases like gangs or gang intimidation or violence among people who are known to each other, there's a difficulty in bringing charges. But when you arrest the person, they actually have in their possession drugs or sometimes a gun, and the possession charge therefore becomes the only charge that they elect to adjudicate as a way of making sure there's some punishment, but also were cases where witnesses or others might be difficult to obtain. This gives you the category of arrests among drugs, but you saw that drug arrests were a small portion of overall arrests as well, because sometimes the issue is about arrests. I'm not going to go into any detail here. I have 2 examples of when I was in office of what we did with 2 foreign countries, Colombia and Afghanistan. I'll be happy to talk about those, but I want to stop talking and be able to kind of cover any questions you have. I want to close on 2 points. As I say, I think this is a difficult problem because it comes from a free choice of free individuals. It starts with somebody deciding they're going to take something and use it themselves. And an argument would be, a straightforward argument would be, well, it's not the states, and people make this argument. You hear it all the time. Some of you probably believe it. The state has no right to be involved with this kind of decision. The problem, of course, is that for a significant portion of those who start down this path, they become a problem for themselves and others. Now, we can have a debate about how far we should go. Should we let people, regularly, become incapacitated and ultimately be on the street and in some cases slowly dying before our eyes? There's one set of issues that kind of consideration concerns. The other is when you become violent and disorganized and you start preying on other people as a part of the phenomenon of your substance abuse. Many of I didn't put up the data because I didn't want to make this more cluttered than it already is. There's been testing of arrestees for substances of abuse. Alcohol is the largest, but marijuana is the second largest, and of course heroin, crack, things like PCP and methamphetamine were particularly associated with crime and also quite violent and self-destructive crime and behavior. We know that these substances also lead people into prostitution. We know that these substances also lead people into just patterns of behavior where their life becomes in collapse. It varies, but there's enough of the system and the number of people. There are now an estimated, you saw in that survey, roughly 22, 23 million people who use one of the illegal drugs once a month or more frequently. There are over 50 million with the same survey methodology who say they smoke cigarettes once a month or more frequently. And there's about 130 million Americans who say they drink alcohol once a month or more frequently. So when you think about both the relative rates of problem that these substances cause, but also the magnitude of the part of the population that's involved with this, what does it look like if instead of 20 million Americans using these drugs, it reaches 50 million. It'd be a different America. And the other point I wanted to make is there is, of course, some history of this around the world. And in fact, unlike a lot of other places, no nation has sustained over a significant period of time the open legalization of all these drugs. Even marijuana, when I was in office, the great polar alternatives were for a while the United States and the Netherlands. We were like, harsh and repressive, and the Netherlands was foolishly cavalier about this. But the Netherlands was trying to put this back in the box. It was trying to close down these coffee houses and change the face of this, partly because over time it became unsustainable. You hear now today that Portugal is the great new example, except Portugal's had problems with both. Many of these countries have problems even tracking what's happening because while our data has certain problems and limits of what we know, none of these countries have that kind of data collection, and especially in close to the same kind of time limits. So it becomes, when you make this change, it becomes hard to know what's going on until quite visible things start happening. But it's not so easy to control these things, and no country has ever failed to go back. England's gone back and forth a couple times. As I said, the Netherlands gone back and is tried to go back and put this back under greater control. We've had various points in time where we've had more or less tolerance and acceptance of this. It is a problem because our society has tolerated this for a long time. It's harder to handle with prevention. And if you don't both control the supply and the demand, it is very difficult to sustain any program on either side because unbounded demand will tend to draw supply, and unbounded supply will tend to create demand. I think what happened with, for example, the prohibition example I showed you was, if you look at the quantity consumed, the heavy users consume much more than a non-heavy user. So if you want to look at how much supply is drawn in, you need to build a cadre of dependent, addicted users. When you have that cadre, that is the large force pulling in more supply. That supply then, of course, is available for more people to become involved and to fill that cycle. So there is a kind of building that goes on, and it sometimes takes a number of years. That's what I think happens in some of the countries that have taken a while to realize and look at the problem. This will obviously still be a point of debate. It's a more intense debate now. We're doing some experiments in places like Colorado and Washington State. But my own experience is we know too much. I mean, we know something about what's going to happen to people when they're exposed to this on a wide level. We kind of don't want to, we want to pretend like we don't know it, or we want to pretend that, well, it's not going to be that. But, there will be significant and I believe unsustainable consequences, and I think they'll probably manifest sooner rather than later. The difficulty with all that is it does change people's susceptibility, and it does change the number of victims quite dramatically, quite I'll stop there.
Thank you. Questions? Right. Peter Scarry.
Thank you, Harvey. Thanks, John. Really interesting talk. I wanted to ask you, kind of bring you back to the character question that you raised, and ask you to think about, or tell us about what you thought about the interesting way, to my mind, these issues play out in the context of Alcoholics Anonymous. I don't know how much you know about it. I'm sure you know more about it than I do, but I've had a fair amount of exposure through family members, been to lots of AA meetings, met lots of people in AA, and I've always been intrigued how there's this interesting interplay between acceptance within that rubric of alcoholism as a disease, over which alcoholics have no control, that they're helpless. That's the ideology. But at the same time, that renders that somehow gets transmogrified into individuals taking responsibility for themselves. And I've never quite figured out exactly. That's a little bit like transubstantiation for me. I don't quite know how it works, but
You're raising the bar pretty high there.
it seems to, and it seems like there ought to be something we can learn from that. At least how we think or talk about drugs, because it seems like a similar kind of dialectic.
Yeah, I think the way a lot of people in the medical community talk about this, and I'm not a scientist or physician. I've tried to couch my remarks by saying we depend on that information, and I've tried to learn a lot about it, but I'm not the guy doing the research up front. But we don't think about some of these phenomenon we have just problems apparently kind of grasping kind of proportions on these things. This is not unlike other behavioral diseases, other behavioral changes. I thought about the same thing when I thought about things like the rates of recidivism, both in criminal justice and in terms of treatment, the relapse rate. And I asked I was thinking about it at the time, and I asked a cardiologist friend of mine. I said, "Look, you work with the typically normal, sometimes quite prosperous males and females, and they come in and you tell them, look, you've got hypertension, you have to stop eating this and do that, and watch your weight and so forth." I said, just in general, what percentage of the people you tell that, saying that if you don't do this, essentially you're going to die soon, or than you would otherwise. So there is this kind of fundamental deterrent factor. And what percentage of them actually do it? About 10%. First time. Which suggests that some of the treatment success rate and even frankly the recidivism rate of prison on general on crime, you say, well, it's a revolving door. Well, about a third to 40% offend, and they're pretty tough people to influence compared to a middle-aged person with hypertension, so we have some problems on behavioral self-destructive behavior and just deterring that, convincing people to change that behavior. I think in the case of, I do think AA is a unique phenomenon that we don't talk enough about because, we talked about roughly 2 million people in the world of treatment provided by institutions and facilities. There's at least 2 million people in AA and NA. Mm. And maybe more because many of these facilities use this is completely voluntary, non-government activities, that sustain people in their recovery. But we also recognize that there's a kind of an acuteness. Generally speaking, when you talk about treatment, by the time you get to AA or NA, either by themselves or with the help of some kind of medical protocol, people have been so-called detoxed. They've gotten over the acute effects of the substance in terms of withdrawal been stabilized. In some cases, they are also pharmacologically helped in that process by using something that either, like methadone, is a substitute for the opioid that helps you control your craving, but doesn't have all the other psychoactive effects, and it's done in a controlled dosage. Or there are so-called blockers, things you can take that will prevent the substance, if you take it, from having the psychoactive effect and helping you break that behavioral craving and so forth. There's also agonists that react, like if you take Antabuse when you're in treatment for alcohol. It's a medication you can take where if you drink alcohol, you get violently ill. It's used by some treatment. There's also been a desire to create, and the federal government's been funding this for a while, things like a vaccine, which will essentially use your immune system to create antibodies that would then bind to the psychoactive chemical, and there's I'm not a scientist, but there's a special membrane called the blood-brain barrier that essentially tries to screen very carefully, especially the blood that goes to the brain. If you could create a molecule that's big enough it doesn't go through that membrane, you wouldn't be able to get these substances to the brain. And there are other kinds of substances you can take that will go to what we now believe is the receptor at which these substances attach to the brain and do what they do, that will prevent the effect. So it's not, yes, it is about, and especially NA and AA have been very much developed with the notion of you have to admit you have a problem. I'm John, I'm an alcoholic. And then also to help you kind of talk about this. And there's been a lot of work on kind of behavior modification. What are triggers? You may have heard some of that. Some of you may have been with people like this that go through, I drink when I smoke. So, okay, well, then try to separate smoking and drinking. Or I drink when I come home from work. Well, then try to find another thing to do. Or, it's a kind of substitute of the things that trigger this. There's interesting phenomenon here about the way in which we form certain kind of habits. We were talking about this last night. The most common experience people have with this is cigarette smoking, although that's, for some generations here, probably less common. But if some of you have been smokers in your life, even if you stopped for 10, 20 years, if you went back to start smoking, you would not start as a naive smoker. You would quickly start smoking again. If you were a 2-pack-a-day smoker, you'd start smoking 2 packs a day. Your body in some ways remembers this, whether it's the way in which the craving would affect your brain or the way in which your experience is remembered. And I'm not sure we know that. But so the AANA is trying to both get you to think about, make this more present to your conscious decision making, but also trying to help you see that there are others who are both successful and working about this. And one of the things I think was quite touching about these phenomenon is, and working with people who were in recovery, is most of the experiences these folks have is that their continued sobriety depends on helping others stay sober. They are quite devoted to their brothers and sisters, both religiously and just as a personal ethic. I mean, they really live with a kind of commitment to other people that, some of the people I work with in Washington kind of talk about they believe, but they don't live it. And so in some ways they're another kind of version of what Americans think of themselves as. I really care about others. I take care of them. I don't leave them alone. And there's some of the people who have been harmed the most by this. So yeah, I do think that a behavioral disease is also a problem because on the one hand, you're impaired and this is not your fault. On the other hand, changing is your responsibility. So you have to kind of so-called take responsibility and do that. But it's obviously a mixture, and look, we have it's easier especially on a mass basis to talk about an issue that's not a mixture. That is, clearly one thing or the other thing, and that everybody it's not a complex thing or a specialized thing. We can all talk about it. Should there be compulsory mass education for young people? Okay. Not a simple thing, but the kind of general issue there is something we can all talk about. If you start talking about things that start getting nuanced, like healthcare, or things like this, then it's harder to have a public discussion. Or what the public discussion tends to focus on is, try to find the big things that seize people, whether or not those things are at the core of the phenomenon. But that's just free government, That's the founders wanted. They didn't really expect you to have government by, a few people who claim to be smart or pass the SAT. We're all supposed to get a voice here.
Let me ask, now that Massachusetts has joined the bandwagon for legalizing marijuana, we call it medical marijuana, but you can get a prescription if you have a sprained ankle. It's basically, we've legalized marijuana. What do you say to people who say, well, it's silly to outlaw marijuana because it's really no different from alcohol, which is generally accepted, and it's much more like alcohol than it is like cocaine or heroin, so it should be legalized. How do you respond distinguishing between marijuana and why it shouldn't be legalized and so-called hard drugs?
Well, part of that is what I meant when I said I think these are matters of prudential decisions and not categories or a priori issues. One question that I think your point brings up is, okay, we have some things that we've made compromises with that we know are destructive, alcohol and cigarettes. The simple-minded way to say is that, well, we have to let everything. Anything that's self-destructive has to be okay, because we have to be consistent. That's kind of silly. Nobody really believes that. I mean, we try to blend the good and the bad in ways that are better or worse, even though there are going to be differences of opinion about that. Some of I think the actual data of what's happening now, to the extent to which it is, clear, shows we already have a serious problem with marijuana. Look, when I came back to the Drug Policy Office with President George W. Bush. I had served with Bill Bennett under Bush's father in the office. I was surprised, even though I'd worked on this going back when I was the Department of Education, when I first got involved with this on the prevention side during Reagan. I was surprised at the extent to which marijuana had become a major part of this problem. Marijuana is a source for more treatment need than all other illegal drugs combined, and that's only growing right now. So, now, it has different characteristics that make people say, well, it's just both the old view of it, it's not really a drug, we overreact to the drug, but it also isn't toxic in the same way that cocaine and heroin or methamphetamine are. You do not have overdose deaths from marijuana. But you obviously have, maybe this because it's more tolerated in the popular culture, you have many more people using it and many more people being involved with the treatment. I actually do not believe we would be as seriously talking about the drug problem if it weren't for marijuana. It's the way in which it both becomes a serious problem of abuse itself, but also one of the patterns of these behaviors is, especially for young people and when they start, is they become they can move toward what are called polydrug users. I get used to getting high. Some people stay with one substance, alcohol or marijuana, but a lot of people who end up down this path start. I drink and I drug. I take marijuana. I take methamphetamine. I take some pills. I take some stimulants. In fact, you see a lot of this with people, especially when you get the reports of things like celebrities, where they are so-called self-medicating. They're taking both stimulants and depressants because they're having problems with the going up and down, so they're trying to stretch out a pattern of both wellness or euphoria. And so you see these things like speedballs or other kinds of things from the past where they're actually trying to regain some kind of composure. Many people who go into treatment, for example, now, even if when they're compelled, they do not intend to get clean and sober. They intend to go back to controlled use of both alcohol and drugs. That's what they're going back to. I want to go back to when it's fun and I'm in control. And so they're coming in, their own goal is not going to be successful. So, that's another factor in this. I think with regard to marijuana, I think it's already worse than people believe, and this is only going to make it more extreme. I do not believe there is any evidence, when you really look at the hard facts, that you could sustain the open distribution of marijuana on a wide scale over time. No country has done it. And I don't believe where we've done it, it's been sustainable.
So why is that when we do sustain the open distribution of alcohol, and we don't think that people who have, wine with dinner are actually doing themselves any harm at all? So what is the bright red line?
Well, I just think that what you see with the patterns already of the relationship for use to dependency. For example, on these crude measures, and I really want to emphasize that the self-reported data has limits on it, but roughly a third of the users are dependent. Alcohol, it's roughly 10 to 12%. That doesn't mean that when you get to 130 million people, that means there's like 13 million people. But the rates, and especially now, because now the argument too about comparing marijuana to alcohol, you see sometimes read, they're looking back at studies that were done on marijuana that did not have the current THC rate. The average rate in the United States is over 10%. That's just the average. And in these stores that are selling it, as I say, we're going to 20+%. The Europeans do have experience. That's what partly the Dutch were talking about when they wanted to roll back the coffee houses. They considered the high potency marijuana a different drug. But that's what the market is going to do with this. And look, for my friends who are libertarians who kind of say, well, we ought to do this, and then the next stage is, well, we have people who are dependent, they don't want to get clean and sober, the government ought to give them the drug. And that's done, as you may know, in some European countries, for both opiates and for other drugs. But for my friends that are more libertarian-minded, it's like, really? You really want the government to now allow people to become addicted and control the source of their addiction? Is that really a step toward individual freedom? Or is that a step toward a government that has unbelievable control of its individuals? I once, I'll stop with this, I was in Amsterdam, and I met with federal officials, and they took me to see city officials. And one of them was hadn't quite gotten the memo about we're changing our policy here. And they take me to a place where they have these apartments for people who are addicted, and they give them the apartment, and they give them controlled, in this case it was opioids, because they were heroin addicts. And she said, and she probably said, look, we don't have any problem, they stay in the apartment, they're very compliant. And I said, well, is that a problem for a democratic government, that it controls? I said, of course, people are compliant. They for the purposes of serving their dealer in your country and mine, they'll prostitute themselves, they'll degrade themselves, they'll destroy themselves, they'll do anything. I said, is that okay for a democratic government to be following that path? And then the federal official said, we have to go to another stop now.
Well, let me just ask a little bit more about that, about differences of soul or mind, which are attached to the different drugs. James Q. Wilson once said, tobacco shortens your life, and cocaine debases it. Whereas wine, whiskey, delicious cocktails. Wine has vintages. You have wine tasters, people who can tell you what vintage it comes from and how to describe the flavors and the tastes, which I don't think applies to marijuana. Although you said there are degrees of potency, but what goes with what, Howard? And this might not be captured just by the single word addictive.
Yeah, I think less of the emphasis I would put on kind of varieties, because there are varieties of these other substances. That's why even heroin dealers will brand their product partly for reasons of safety, because you don't know what you're getting, and you want a consistency both of not getting ripped off but also not getting poisoned. Yeah, now there's now a new blooming connoisseur market on marijuana, which is of course out there. But I think the difference is the fundamental one really comes from the issue of the effect of the consumption. It is very difficult to take the major substances of abuse, the illegal drugs, and do what you're talking about with regard to wine. Almost every consumption is to intoxication. Certainly that's true of heroin, certainly that's true of many of the opioids, and for most people, that's the way marijuana is consumed. It's not titrated, although there are people, advocates of it, that say, well, it'll be titrated and it'll be like an after-dinner drink or something. And one of the problems for young people also is the way they both consume these substances and alcohol, frankly. They tend, at each point of use, to drink to intoxication. That will, we know, shorten the time for dependency. If I make you intoxicated and make you intoxicated repeatedly and at shorter time intervals, no matter what your other risk factors, that is the way to to move you toward dependency. And one of the other things that we now know that we didn't know before is that, and the reason this is dangerous for young people is that apparently what we now think is the process of maturation in the brain of human beings that continues up through age 20, that the susceptibility of the brain to be affected by these chemicals in ways that cause dependency is much greater prior to age 20. We have longitudinal studies that suggest if you don't use alcohol, tobacco, or cigarettes before age 20, you're unlikely to start using them afterwards. And if you do start using them afterwards, your risk of becoming dependent on them or habitual users is much less. Conversely, the younger you become exposed or dependent as an adolescent, the more likely you are to have a permanent lifelong risk of greater dependency and abuse. My generation of baby boomers, some of you are in that group, has had this kind of longitudinal phenomenon of much higher rates of dependency and abuse as we age out. Now in our 50s and 60s, we are now much higher in our rates of substance abuse. And being an alcoholic does raise your risks for being drug dependent, or being drug dependent does raise your risk for alcoholism. There is a kind of poly effect of these that I'm not sure we understand all the details of.
Yes.
So I'm afraid I have to disagree with almost every single thing that you said. The only thing we agree about is that the self-reported data on drug use are problematic. But let me boil it down to three things. So first, there are many, many studies in peer-reviewed journals which examine the impact of reduced enforcement or reductions in criminal penalties or decriminalization or some kind of increased legal access to drugs, and they universally find minimal effects in contrast to the implication of what you're suggesting. In particular, pointing to a very low, zero reported rate of alcohol use during alcohol prohibition is bizarre.
No, I did say, the chart doesn't say zero, it says there's a gap in the data.
Because the government didn't collect it, because it technically didn't exist, officially didn't exist. If you look at cirrhosis death rates, or alcoholism death rates, or alcohol overdoses, then you can see that it continued apace, and indeed some indicators show big spikes during alcohol prohibition. So second, the evidence is that the effects of prohibition reducing use are modest. Second point I'd emphasize is that you've only thought about one side of drug use. Lots of people believe that they get benefits from using drugs. Now, you sort of talked about that in talking about democracy and a free society and the presumption. I would add in there, thinking about it from the perspective of the Constitution, I find it hard to see in any of the 13 enumerated powers the justification for the federal government to ban anything. It just seems utter, I mean, you can make it up, but then you can justify the federal government doing absolutely anything you want. Third point is that even if prohibitions reduce drug use to some degree, and they certainly may seem to do it a little bit, even if you think that they're mainly reducing abuse rather than benign use, but the evidence doesn't support that, but even if you thought that, the prohibitions are having huge negative impacts themselves. They're generating violence because they drive the markets underground, they're generating corruption, they're generating much worse health outcomes for those people who continue to use because they're not being able to get a reliable source of known purity that's unadulterated and so on and so forth. So I think you should just painted an incredibly incomplete picture of what we should think about in deciding whether drugs should be prohibited or not.
Let me take the points in reverse order. the consequences of drug use in terms of addiction, in terms of problematic and self-destructive behavior, are not because the drugs aren't pure or the drugs aren't available. It's because the drugs are.
No, it's in many cases, it's because they're prohibited. The reason people are injecting, for the most part, heroin, amphetamines, is because they're expensive and you get a bigger bang for the buck when you inject it. If it's illegal, it's cheaper, people consume it in other ways, and they don't share dirty needles and get HIV. HIV is clearly much worse than the alleged negative effects of the drug use per se. Okay? If smoking marijuana is bad for you because of the smoke, then high THC marijuana, readily available, allows you to take very few puffs and still get whatever level of intoxication you choose.
Yeah,
So
I know that argument,
negative
but
effects.
again, and I don't want to leave this to be for people who don't read the literature. Well, there's like he said, she said studies here, because I don't really think that's the case. Let me take an example where I believe there is agreement in this, maybe not with you, and that is the studies of underage smoking. We've had that decline, significantly decline, and government and non-government organizations have done multiple studies to say, how did that happen? Multiple regression analysis. And certainly education, efforts to change societal attitudes are a huge factor. But almost all those studies I'm aware of and the meta-analysis done of those studies have shown that the single biggest factor, almost by every serious study in this, has been the price of tobacco going up. Every time you raise the price 10%, cigarette smoking by youth goes down 7%, as a crude example.
So I agree that's more nuanced. There are certainly studies which support the claim you made.
Well,
but there are a lot of studies which
all right, let's take a macro phenomenon. Does Walmart have widespread and cheap prices because they expect people to titrate their buying, or they expect to win on volume? If you make a substance that people want cheaper and more widely available, I do believe I think it's pretty hard to argue that it's not going to be more widely used. There are multiple experiences that people have that show that's the case. And that has been the case with marijuana. That certainly has been the case with cocaine. That's been the case with heroin. That's been the case with prescription pharmaceuticals. The widespread available use of these things, both now in the prescription pharmaceuticals, some access and dependency caused by legitimate medical care. But also the ability to have these on a wider scale has contributed to their abuse. Now you say, when you see people saying, well, now people are going back to heroin from this. Why is that? Well, because now the claim is, well, the pharmaceutical supply, because of the enforcement against so-called pill mills, has closed off some of that option. As I said, the other contributing factor that I believe is what's happened to the explosion of quantity of heroin coming out of Mexico, which is the predominant source for the U.S. market.
So
What about benign use? That was your point.
I'm an economist, so I'm certainly not going to disagree that price
This is
one-
enough. Let him
Okay.
answer the 3 points.
Well,
that you made.
again, sure. I mean, the people who are using and in a state of euphoria will have the experience of, this is not problematic. This is good. And I'm not someone who tells, when I would talk to young people, I wouldn't tell them, I don't think it's legitimate to tell people, when you take these, they're bad. There are people who have bad reactions initially. But the reason we have this problem, we talk about this last evening, is because they're great. Taking these substances are, in fact, they're so great, some people can't stop. And different people have different experiences with this. But it's not because this tastes like, Tabasco sauce on your tongue when you take it. It's because it causes people to feel very good, and so good that it tends to override their ability to see the other effects it's having in their life. And again, it varies from person to person, and it is true that some people will say, it doesn't bother. But again, you have also the corollary phenomenon that we talked about earlier of denial. The worst person sometimes to ask about how's this affecting you is the person who's in the midst of consuming. Now, sometimes they are a legitimate judge, but sometimes they're not. Do you want to ask Justin Bieber about marijuana right now?
Why is the government a better judge? aren't there huge dangers of saying that the government gets to decide what's good or bad for us?
Well-
Which books we can read, which religions we can practice,
Well,
which substances we consume,
but-
what
but in-
occupations we can choose?
Okay, I've been what I would consider a conservative in Republican governments for a long time. I've done a number of things that I thought were valuable to try to talk about the scope of government, government regulation, and other things. But I would say in a lot of things in these areas, the government is us. We reflect, the government does reflect through its representatives what people want, including when people are of more than one mind or two minds and multiple minds on things. And it means that there is, in some cases, and I mean, look, I'll bow to other people here who are much wiser about the Constitution and so forth, but my understanding of it, both when I was an academic and now that I've served in government, is your reading of the Constitution won't really stand up. The Constitution does say certain things the government must not do. It says something about what the government should be structured like. But it allows a wide range of government by consent of the governed to regulate and create a society that the governed want, including wide ranges of regulation, of law, of economic influence and law and structure. Now, again, maybe it can be used imprudently, but I don't think it's unconstitutional. And I think this is a case where there have been evolved opinions about alcohol, about cigarettes, about drugs, and there probably will continue to be. And how you structure those desires and what the consequences are and how you adjust to consequences are important. But I think it's really, I think it's very hard to have any serious purchase on the argument that government can't really regulate certain kinds of behavior, certain kinds of activities for the sake of a decent civilized society. You may disagree with it, but it's not illegitimate for the representatives and the people to say, we want to structure our society this way rather than that way.
Yes.
So my question is really the obverse of his. On the one hand, so I
I'm
think
all wet for another reason.
I think it's it's completely legitimate for the government to damp down these kinds of behaviors. My question, it seems to me, though, it's always been anomalous that, given that it's legitimate for government to do this, that the whole emphasis is on supply, not demand, right? As if since the actual the deeply troubling behavior is the consumption, we punish the suppliers. And I can see that has some value because in an economic sense, because it drives up the price. But that's all it does. Right? And I wonder, is that really a sufficient way of approaching this? If drugs are bad, if they're not bad, then, let's just go out and get high. But if they are bad, and they are, shouldn't there be some effort to moralize this more and be more somehow critical of the users? It's true, a lot of users are casual; they're not really doing any harm. It doesn't seem to be possible to so clearly demarcate who is and who isn't. So I don't know. I mean, prostitution has some of the same character, but that doesn't seem to be such a big problem for this particular society. I'd just like your thoughts on that, since you're the ex-Czar.
Used to be introduced like that to like high school and elementary school kids, and it's one of those things. Just like you can't really erase it once it gets in the popular culture. The term czar, but and the more you rub at it, the more stupid it is. But I used to say that, of course, there aren't any czars, and a lot of people have given their lives to make sure there isn't. So but. Sure, what you'd like is to have as much as possible these kinds of the behavior and the acceptability of behavior to be in the form of self-control.
that you can kind of persuade people, look, these are the reasons you shouldn't do it, and you should, or if they won't, on the basis of a kind of kind of empirical or disinterested explanation, if you would use what used to be called shame, that it's immoral and you should be ashamed of yourself if you do that. Now that is still the case, I think, in a lot of ways, when people say that, and that's one of the reasons why people are not candid about their use or their family's experience with this, is they're ashamed of it. There has been a lot of work about whether or not to try to remove so-called stigma from this for the purposes of getting people to come into treatment, to getting society to more widely accept it. And I think I'm actually on the side of trying to bring people into treatment on this and make it more acceptable. But on the issue of can you find ways of using the government to discourage use, you can a bit. I mean, I think you can do things like what we've done for example, in transportation safety, of using things like drug testing or drug testing in the military to say the testing is really, it's thought of as a kind of got you, but it's really a prevention tool. I can't use, I get a test. We were the first administration to allow schools to receive federal money to create random testing programs, but that was after the Supreme Court said that schools that use random testing may not use it to punish. They cannot turn the students over. It must be done confidentially, and it must be done to get them and their families help if they need it. It's been an enormously powerful tool in the schools that have done it, and if you talk to the students, it's the most convincing thing about why you might want to do testing. It's because you'll frequently hear them say, look, I have friends at other schools, and I would have gotten involved in trouble, but I could say, look, I can't do it, I get tested. It was a way of answering the usual problem that students have, which is, I don't want to alienate my friends, and God, I don't want to be judgmental. So but this gives me an excuse that's external to me, and I don't have to offend anybody. But aside from things like that, or issues where how would you discover people who use? I mean, you could get people who are intoxicated while they're driving from drugs or from alcohol, and there is some of that, suspending driver's license and so forth. But it's not so easy both to detect and to have proportional sanctions.
When the cops do a drug bust, they don't punish the buyer, do they? They punish the dealer. Do they?
Yeah. Well, this is the so-called, what I talked about is the kind of myth that there's a bunch of people in prison who are really just, they're walking around. They were going to choir practice. They had a baggie of marijuana in their jeans, and police stopped them for no reason at all, found the baggie, and sent them to prison. Well, that doesn't happen. I got in trouble with the drug legalizers because I said, you will find a unicorn before you find that person. And if you type my name into the great white web, you will find pictures of me with unicorns. And so they're very creative. They have a lot of time down there living in their mom's rec room, so they got a lot of time to work on the web. It's not so easy to kind of see that. And one other thing I would say is, I think one of the reasons that as good people who respect freedom in individuals, we want to say this should be something that people are making decisions themselves. We want them to be accountable, as you say. But aside from what we say together, and now the tendency for us is to not say. The overwhelming, I think, moral force from most people in most institutions is to not be judgmental. So we don't say much about anything. Now, that isn't to say that there aren't very strong, politically correct forces, especially on college campuses, but in societies in general, that say what you can't say, what you can't do, or what you can't advocate. But in this area, it's both tied up with politics and some kind of cultural dynamic, so it's very difficult to say you should be ashamed of yourself if you do that. I'll tell you one way I did do that. I was invited a couple of years, I don't do much of this anymore, especially on college campuses, so Harvey asked me, I did it because of all of many things I owe him. But I was invited to Yale, to law school, to debate law school professor Stephen Duke. Stephen Duke, who was he'd written a piece in the Wall Street Journal and paired with me. And I was invited up there, and we had this debate. He gave, various arguments, not as sophisticated as some of yours, but some of the ones that you would expect on this. It was it was early November, before Thanksgiving. And he had spent some time kind of saying that we were all kind of, that in fact, the motives of the people I worked with were to be oppressive to people of color and other things. So he basically called me as many names as he could think of on campus, but in the nicest possible way. So I concluded by saying, this is all right to kind of talk about all this and everything else, but I said, I think it's important to be serious about this. And I said, I would have found it more impressive if Professor Duke had said, and I really believe this, people should be able to do this, and this year, when we have my Thanksgiving dinner at my house, and the grandkids and the aunts and uncles are all here and everything else, after we get done with the turkey and the trimmings, we're going to break out the crack and the meth and the heroin and the marijuana, and we're going to enjoy this, because we believe it's important for Americans to be able to do this, and we want it. And I said, well, that just sounds ridiculous, because we don't expect him to do it. But if we did expect him to do it, it would be worse than ridiculous. It would sound monstrous. What are you doing? And I said, but what Professor Duke is advocating is not that this happened to his family, but that happened to somebody else's family. And in my view, that is monstrous. And we know too much about what's going on here, and we shouldn't either advocate it, although we have a free speech, and I'm not trying to repress that. But secondly, we ought to understand that the consequences of this as a society are very harmful for very many communities and very many individuals, and many of them are going to be young. They're not going to be the ones who vote to do this. The people who live with the consequences of this are the least able to have access to political power. I believe that, even though I'm not a leftist about this. And they're the ones who are least able to protect themselves because they're young and vulnerable. And there's no accountability for that. You get to say this crap all the time, and people just say, oh, well, that's just, you're standing up for what's culturally right, or, you're just being playful and everything else. It really has consequences, but those consequences, people are generally not held accountable.
Susan?
Following up on that comment, it does, drugs do have horrible consequences, and I'm all in favor of decreasing their usage, but the war on drugs also has horrible consequences. And I wonder, when we're talking about democracy specifically, about, we make these choices, we enact these laws, we start the war on drugs. When we say we don't, we are one community, we're all Americans, but the elephant in the room has been race here, it seems to me. We haven't, and I'm sure you have many thoughts of this. I wonder if you could say a few words about how the war on drugs disproportionately affects different communities. So I imagine there are many people in the inner city communities who are devastated both by drugs and by the war on drugs. And perhaps they would prefer to live in a world in which drugs were legal, because then they'd only at least have to battle drugs and not also the war on drugs. And particularly the numbers you mentioned of the inmates in state prisons, it's only 20% roughly if you add up the drug offenders, but that's still 200 to 400,000 people, in any given year, and that's just the state, let alone federal. So if you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah, I'll make it specific in two ways. I spent a lot of time in inner city communities, sitting with community groups and both elected officials and citizens in these areas. My experience was different from what you hear and what is captured by your remarks. First of all, kind of the war metaphor came from a time when people were trying to get us to take this seriously. It came from Nixon, and it's now thought of as, well, we're fighting a war on our own people. That was not the intent. The intent was to protect the people the way we protected ourselves from an external enemy. But in the communities I saw parents and citizens that wanted the same thing people want in the white suburbs. They just don't get it because the sustained effort to stabilize some of these areas has not been as I think as forceful and as well run as it should be. I agree with you that one of the problems is that the penalties and the criminal enforcement was hoped, people like Joe Biden, Pat Leahy, Charlie Rangel supported the mandatory minimum crack law when it was first passed because it was preying on inner city neighbors, and they wanted people punished who were doing that. The problem was the thought was that we were going to have this new tool. It's going to be very powerful, and it's going to stop this victimization. It didn't, and you have now multiple generations of males, basically, from inner city communities that have come into the criminal justice system. But not just from the drug laws. I mean, as much as the violence and the enforcement from the drug laws is a problem, I think a fair reading, and it's not done very often, of the consequences of drug use and crime is the influence it has on catalyzing people who already have unstable lives and problems with individual self-control and have problems with simple socialization. That this becomes an enormous driver, in no matter what the race, of young men who are already in some problematic state with regard to their own socialization. So yes, there are problems with enforcement, but this also is a factor when you talk about aggravated assault, when you talk about rape, when you talk about all kinds of other violent crime. And as I said, some of these possession arrests are really because somebody got stopped because they were involved in another crime. And when they were searched, they had the drugs on them. The other crime is difficult to adjudicate, so they're going to be charged with possession because of the nature of the offense. And even then, it's going to take a relatively long rap sheet for the possession charge to result in any actual time in most jurisdictions. But the people that I talk to in these communities, the last thing they want is for you to stop enforcing the law. You know, I sat in a community in Washington D.C. in the late 1980s with a group in Anacostia, and with Bennett, and a woman stood up and got right up to the podium and said, "I want you to shoot these drug dealers." And people were starting to go, "Ooh, come on." And she said, "Shut up. If it was your kids walking to school past these people, you would shoot them if you had to. Why won't you do that for my children?" It is true they live in a community where the victimization out in the open would not be tolerated where I live in Chevy Chase, D.C., would not be tolerated in Cambridge. And if people couldn't get the law to do it, they'd hire people. These people don't have the resources to do that, but some of them will walk their own community. The other thing I used to do for a while when this started to become more of a topic of legalization, and in the George W. Bush administration I was there, when I went to treatment centers, I would ask people, all right, you've all been, some of you are court directed into treatment. You've seen a lot of what the so-called war on drug does. Would you like drugs to be legalized? Should we end the prohibition? I did it like 3 times and I stopped. And do you know why? Because it was so hard, it was so thoughtless and offensive to these people. Because their response was, "Look at us. Would you really want more people? Do you want to make it harder for us? Do you really want to try less to protect people from this? Aren't we enough of an example of what is at stake here? How can you want this to be more widely available?" And I think your question, from my point of view, it sounds to me, and I'm reading into it, it overstates the harm and the harmful, what you would call the harmful consequences of the current legal regime and its enforcement, and understates the harm of what drugs do and the consequences of it. That's my experience.
One more. Yes.
Yeah, I'm interested in this question of the dangers of the drug war, if you can call it that, or let's just say legal enforcement of anti-drug policies in the U.S. And how that actually, or what kind of research has been done into the other arrests that have been made for charges not involving drugs. How many of those actually, though, are come as a result of rampant, let's say, gang violence and gangs being formed around drug economies? How many of those are also thefts due to the need to gain money to buy drugs which are incredibly expensive at an illegal street price? And then, I guess related to that, the question of economy and supply is quite interesting here, because what we haven't talked about yet is why so many young people end up, well, at least in certain communities, end up dealing drugs, and how that's related to the lack of other opportunities for them. So we haven't talked about minimum wage, for example, being much lower than what a normal teenager could make dealing drugs on the street, and how you think if legalizing or at least declining penalties for drugs might change that dynamic of, you know, the expensive drugs actually being not necessarily the drugs themselves, but the economy around dealing drugs actually being an attractive option for a lot of young people who, for lack of good education policies or for lack of opportunities, don't really have another option.
There's a number of things in your question, and to be fair, I'll try to sort out a couple, but I won't claim to be able to kind of do justice to all the parts. Look, I started out in the Department of Education. One of the fundamental problems that we have is that we do not do a very good job educating the citizens in this country that start out with some of the least opportunity. We have tried very hard across Democrat and Republican administrations to do education reform and other kinds of things. And there's been some improvements in some places, a lot of people. But it is true that the opportunities that many people face, especially in major urban areas and the educational systems there that are broken and have not been fixed, are a huge, huge disadvantage added on top of the other disadvantages. A bigger disadvantage, though, is not having a stable family, and it's specifically not having fathers. I do think that while that's not popular in some quarters to talk about, it's undeniable that the consequences of this are devastating to no matter what your race, but it's not equally distributed among socioeconomic or racial groups. We have a lot of data about this. And we also know that the failure to have a father in the young man's life especially has enormously increased risks for leading both to disordered behavior, self-destructive behavior, and criminal behavior. And even the President of the United States has quoted some of those numbers in the past. So it's not about, you have to be a right-wing kook to be able to say that. The problem is, what do we do about that? We have a society that doesn't want to really be very serious about talking about people's individual choices, about stigmatizing having children and not taking responsibility for them, of asking people to be circumspect in their sexual behavior. You know, that's become increasingly difficult to talk about or to be willing for the population to embrace. Maybe that'll change. I don't know. On the issue of the economic advantage to young people, there are variations in this. So it's, you know, this is a generalization I think that's accurate, but I will confess that there are variations in this. Most people who deal drugs at the retail level are involved with use and are doing this to support their own habit. Not all. There have been more organized gangs, and there still are some more organized gangs that do this. However, and there are some people that have made a lot of money quick, but there were some economists that a while that were used to being kind of iconoclast that did an article entitled a number of years ago, "Why Do Most Cocaine Dealers Live with Their Grandmother?" You know, the upshot of the article was that what you actually clear from this stuff, you could actually make more money working on the counter at McDonald's because of the actual apparent, you know, I get to ride around in an expensive SUV and drink, you know, $100,000 vodka, and everything else is a kind of myth. Now, it is a myth that some people believe, but also I think as much in terms of male gang orientation, and here I defer to Harvey, it's a form of socializing young men. There's a kind of manliness in that social order that's lacking as a structure. Now, it's a self-destructive form of it, I believe, but it is a problem of a vacuum in allowing a kind of human connectedness of these young males that the gang provides. And it is terrible that that's the option for young men in too many cases. Not something healthy in school or society or in the family, but a kind of brutal, self-destructive criminal life. But that is true, and I don't think that again, you've got to kind of think about what the problem is, and I urge any of you, the young people who want to go into this, there's a lot of need for very good talent, but you got to go out and meet with people, because you have to figure out what is actually causing what if you want to have a solution. I'll give you one last example that touches on your supply question. When I first took office, I won't go back to the slide, but it's in there. I first took office. I looked at there's a reporting system that's from hospital emergency rooms that measures people who come in under acute conditions for drugs and what drugs. And I knew about this so when I came back in the last time into the administration, I started asking for these reports every month because it's a more empirical source. One. And I noticed that over the course of 6 months, the number of people coming in for LSD dropped 80%. LSD had from the days of the Flower Children, it had a resurgence in the 90s. It was much more widely used. And it dropped 80%. So I went back and asked, why? Does anybody know why? And they, as the bureaucracy does, it just ignored me for a while, even though, you think you work in the White House, you have some kind of pull, but it's like, but I'm a stubborn person in real life. And I kept saying, and I kept asking more and more senior people in the agency until the bosses had to say, will you find out what the answer to his question so he'll stop bothering me? And it turns out that what they found out was the DEA had taken down an LSD production facility that was carried out in an abandoned ballistic missile silo by two guys. One guy had been a former LSD maker in the old Flower Children days and served his time in prison, got back out. And they had made and had precursors to make 23 million doses of LSD. No one knew that LSD production was that centralized in the United States. Until they didn't even realize it after they took it down, until we went back and looked and said, look at how use changed because you went after supply. By the way, these guys were given up by a female friend who they had not treated well, who decided to take revenge on them. So as Machiavelli says, revenge is a powerful passion. You have to understand how these phenomena work if you want to implement policies that make a difference. The decline in meth use was a change in supply. The decline in some of these other substances, the decline in cocaine has gone down by 60%, largely because of the successful supply efforts in Colombia that cut off that supply. It's not the only thing. You have to. I still believe you have to treat supply and demand. We have to treat more people more effectively. But supply is a very important element because it's ultimately these substances' effect on the biochemistry of human beings that create this phenomenon.
So I guess that's kind of very quick.
Well, I think we really need to stop. We're past our usual stopping time. I heard that phrase, when I heard the word revenge, I thought that was a perfect ending. But I want to thank you, John, for coming in.